Canada is burning, not with fire, but with something far more devastating: economic collapse. And the numbers do not lie. 112,000 jobs gone, vanished from the Canadian economy in a single catastrophic wave. Consider what that actually means. 112,000 Canadians who woke up one morning with a paycheck and then didn't. 112,000 families staring at bills they can no longer pay, mortgages they can no longer service, futures they can no longer plan for. This is not a statistical blip. This is not a seasonal adjustment. This is an economy in free fall, and the people in charge either didn't see it coming or, worse, didn't care. For years, Canadians were told the economy was strong. They were told the fundamentals were solid. They were told that the policies being implemented in Ottawa were working, that the middle class was growing, that prosperity was just around the corner. And now, with 112,000 jobs erased from the ledger, we have to ask the question that the political class desperately does not want you to ask. Who did this? And how did they get away with it for so long? The story behind these numbers matters. The decisions, the failures, the warnings that were ignored, and the reckoning that is now impossible to avoid. Stay with me, because what has emerged from this economic catastrophe is more damning than most Canadians have been allowed to understand. Let's start with the scale of what just happened, because context is everything when the political class wants to minimize a disaster of their own making. 112,000 jobs lost in a single month. To understand what that number means, you have to put it alongside historical comparisons. And when you do, the picture becomes genuinely alarming. Canada's labor market has not seen a single month shock of this magnitude outside of the pandemic lockdowns of 2020. Not during the 2008 financial crisis, not during the dot-com collapse, not during any of the major economic downturns of the past 3 decades. This is, by any serious measure, an extraordinary and historic collapse in employment. Statistics Canada confirmed the figures in its April 2025 Labour Force Survey. The unemployment rate surged in a manner that Bank of Canada Governor Tiff Macklem described, with careful understatement, as presenting significant downside risks to the outlook. That phrase is doing an enormous amount of work, because the truth is, this was not unexpected by anyone who had been paying attention to what Canadian economic policy has actually looked like for the past several years. The warning signs were there, the structural vulnerabilities were visible, the reckless spending, the regulatory burden, the carbon tax that crushed small businesses from coast to coast. All of it was building toward exactly this kind of moment. Full-time employment took the hardest hit. These were not part-time positions, not gig economy contracts, not marginal work arrangements. These were the stable, benefit-bearing, career-track jobs that formed the backbone of a middle-class economy. And they disappeared at a rate that should send shockwaves through every level of Canadian government. But here is the thing about shockwaves in Ottawa. They tend to be absorbed very quietly, with a press release and a promise to monitor the situation closely. The sectors hit hardest tell a story of their own. Manufacturing, construction, professional services, the productive core of the Canadian economy, the sectors that actually build things and make things and generate real wealth. These are the sectors that bled the most, and that is not a coincidence. That is the predictable consequence of years of policy choices that prioritized ideology over economic reality. Now let's talk about how Canada arrived at this moment, because disasters of this magnitude do not happen in a vacuum. The Canadian economy has been under sustained pressure for years, and the pressure has come from multiple directions simultaneously. First, there is the debt. Canada's federal debt has exploded over the past decade, with deficit spending that would have been considered fiscally reckless by any previous generation of Canadian politicians, regardless of party. The Parliamentary Budget Officer Yves Giroux warned as recently as 2024 that the federal fiscal trajectory was not sustainable without significant course correction. The interest payments alone now consume a staggering portion of the federal budget. Money that cannot be spent on infrastructure, on healthcare, on the programs that Canadians actually depend on. Every dollar that goes to service debt is a dollar that does not go to building the productive capacity of the economy. That is not opinion. That is arithmetic. Second, there is the regulatory environment. Canadian businesses, particularly small and medium enterprises, have been buried under an avalanche of compliance costs, environmental regulations, and administrative burdens that make it genuinely difficult to operate, to expand, to hire. The carbon tax, which was sold to Canadians as a climate solution, functioned in practice as a tax on production, a tax on transportation, a tax on every single input cost that a business has to manage. The Canadian Federation of Independent Business reported in 2023 that regulatory costs were the single greatest barrier to growth cited by its membership. When you make it more expensive to run a business, businesses hire fewer people. That is not a controversial economic proposition. That is cause and effect. Third, and perhaps most critically, there is the housing crisis that has hollowed out the economic mobility of an entire generation of Canadians. When workers cannot afford to live in the cities where the jobs are, when young Canadians are spending 60, 70, 80% of their income on rent, when the dream of home ownership has become a cruel joke for anyone under 40, you are not looking at a healthy economy. You are looking at an economy that is cannibalizing its own future workforce. These three pressures did not emerge overnight. They were built, brick by brick, through deliberate policy choices. And now the bill has come due. The job losses are not the beginning of the story. They are the moment the story became impossible to ignore. But here is what makes this moment truly explosive. It is not just the job losses, it is the reaction, or rather the absence of one. When the numbers dropped, the political response from the Canadian establishment was precisely what you would expect from people who have spent years insulating themselves from the consequences of their own decisions. There were statements expressing concern. There were commitments to support workers. There were vague references to global headwinds and international economic uncertainty, as if Canada's problems were somehow imported from abroad, as if the policies implemented in Ottawa had nothing to do with the outcome. Think about what that means. 112,000 Canadians lose their jobs, and the political class reaches immediately for the excuse that it is someone else's fault. The Americans, the global economy, the interest rate environment set by central banks. Anyone and anything except the choices made by the people who have been running this country. This is a pattern. It is a deeply familiar pattern to anyone who has watched how governments respond to economic failure. They never caused it. They are always responding to it. The crisis is always external, always unforeseen, always the product of forces beyond anyone's control. And the solutions they propose are always more of the same. More spending, more programs, more government intervention in an economy that has already been distorted by too much of exactly that. Where was the accountability? Where was the honest reckoning with what these policies have actually produced? They were very quiet about that, because accountability requires admitting failure. And admitting failure requires a level of political courage that is apparently in shorter supply in Ottawa than jobs. Now let's examine what the economic data tells us about the trajectory Canada is on, because the job losses are not an isolated event. They are a symptom of something deeper. Consumer confidence in Canada has been declining for months. Retail spending has contracted. Business investment, the lifeblood of job creation, has been weak and getting weaker. The Bank of Canada has been navigating an extraordinarily difficult position, trying to bring inflation under control while simultaneously avoiding the kind of hard landing that crushes employment. And the data suggests that the hard landing is no longer a risk to be managed. It is a reality to be confronted. The housing market, which had been propped up by years of cheap money and speculative investment, is now correcting. And housing corrections in Canada have a way of rippling through the entire economy with devastating force. When housing prices fall, household wealth falls. When household wealth falls, consumer spending falls. When consumer spending falls, businesses contract. When businesses contract, workers lose jobs. This is the chain reaction that economists like David Rosenberg of Rosenberg Research warned about repeatedly, that critics of Canadian housing policy warned about, and that the political establishment spent years dismissing as alarmism. It was not alarmism, it was analysis. And now the analysis has been validated in the most painful way possible, through the lived experience of workers who are now unemployed. The youth unemployment numbers deserve particular attention because they represent the future of the Canadian economy, and the picture they paint is genuinely bleak. Young Canadians between the ages of 15 and 24 are facing unemployment rates that dwarf the national average. These are the workers who were supposed to inherit a functioning economy. Instead, they are inheriting a debt burden, a housing crisis, and a labor market that has just shed jobs at a historic rate. The implications of that reality extend far beyond the current quarter's statistics. Delayed household formation, reduced lifetime earnings, diminished retirement security. The compounding of economic disadvantage across an entire generation. This is not abstract. These are real people, real futures, real damage. And yet, remarkably, the conversation in certain quarters of the Canadian media has been about managing expectations rather than demanding answers, about contextualizing the numbers rather than confronting the people responsible for them. The same institutions that spent years cheerleading for the policies that produced this outcome are now asking Canadians to be patient, to trust the process, to believe that recovery is just around the corner. Canadians have heard that before, and they are running out of patience for it. Now, here is where the story gets even more explosive, because the job losses are not happening in isolation from Canada's broader geopolitical and trade position. Canada's economic relationship with the United States, its single largest trading partner, has become increasingly fraught. The tariff environment, the renegotiation of trade frameworks, the uncertainty that hangs over cross-border commerce. All of this has created a climate of investment hesitation that is directly contributing to the employment collapse. Businesses do not hire when they cannot see clearly into the future. They do not expand when the rules of the game are being rewritten in real time. They contract, they wait, they protect themselves. Canadian exporters, particularly in manufacturing and agriculture, have been caught in a vice between rising domestic costs and an uncertain external trading environment. The combination is lethal. You cannot absorb higher input costs at home while simultaneously facing market uncertainty abroad. Something has to give. And what gives, first and most visibly, is employment. The energy sector tells a particularly instructive story. Canada sits on some of the most significant energy reserves on the planet. The oil sands of Alberta alone represent a resource wealth that, properly developed and exported, could underwrite Canadian prosperity for generations. Instead, Canada has spent years in a policy-induced paralysis over pipeline development, over export capacity, over the fundamental question of whether it will actually exploit its own natural advantages. The result is an energy sector that is perpetually constrained, perpetually fighting regulatory and political battles that its competitors in other countries simply do not face. Meanwhile, the world continues to need energy. The demand has not gone away because Canadian politicians decided that approving pipelines was politically inconvenient. The demand simply went elsewhere, to producers who are less conflicted about developing their resources, less paralyzed by internal political battles, less willing to sacrifice economic output on the altar of ideological positioning. Canada has exported not just energy, but economic opportunity, and the workers who should have been employed in that sector are counted among the losses. The reckoning is here, and it is long overdue. So where does Canada go from here? Because a country does not absorb a shock of this magnitude without making choices about what comes next. And the choices Canada makes in the coming months will determine whether this is a painful correction that leads to genuine reform or the beginning of a longer, deeper decline. The first choice is about fiscal honesty. Canada cannot continue to run deficits at the current scale and expect to maintain the economic stability that attracts investment and supports employment. The math does not work. It has never worked. Every dollar borrowed today is a constraint on the policy options available tomorrow, and Canada has been borrowing at a rate that is foreclosing options at an accelerating pace. A serious government would present a credible path to fiscal balance, not austerity for its own sake, but a genuine recognition that the spending trajectory is unsustainable and that course correction is not optional. The second choice is about regulatory rationalization. If Canada wants businesses to hire, it has to make it possible for businesses to operate. That means taking a hard, honest look at the cumulative burden of regulation, environmental, labor, administrative, and asking which of those regulations are genuinely serving their stated purpose and which are simply adding cost and friction without producing meaningful benefit. This is not an argument for eliminating environmental protection or gutting worker rights. It is an argument for governance that takes economic consequences seriously, that understands that regulations are not free, that the cost of compliance is ultimately borne by workers in the form of fewer jobs and lower wages. The third choice is about energy. Canada must decide clearly and definitively whether it is going to develop its natural resources or not. The current position, perpetually studying, perpetually consulting, perpetually delaying, is not a policy. It is an abdication. The world needs energy. Canada has energy. The connection between those two facts should be straightforward. Making it straightforward requires political leadership that is willing to make an actual decision and defend it, rather than hiding behind process and consultation as a way of avoiding accountability. These are not easy choices. They are not popular in every constituency. But they are the choices that a serious country facing a serious economic crisis has to make. And the Canadians who lost their jobs deserve a government that is willing to make them. Good intentions do not pay rent. Well-meaning policies do not feed families. Results matter. Consequences are real. And Canada is living with the consequences right now. 112,000 jobs erased. And a political class that still has not told the truth about why. That is the verdict of the Canadian economy itself. Cold, mathematical, and impossible to spin away. Subscribe for more.